welcome to the Redmond Historical Society Saturday Speaker Series for Catching a Map Thief. I'm Holly Turner, the host for today's program. Program Committee member Margie Rockenbeck will be helping me monitor the chat and will lead a Q&A session at the end of our presentation today. For now, if you could just let us know that you can in fact see and hear us. To use the chat, just click the chat button at the bottom of your screen. You can then select who you would like to send the message to from the drop down next to "to." Just type your message and press enter to send it. We'd also love to hear from you, how you've heard about this program, who's listening with you today, and how many of you have visited a government library before. Now I'll hand it over to President John Ofterow for a few words about the Society. Good morning, John.
Hey, thanks, Holly. Good morning to all of you for tuning in, and thanks also to the 70+ attendees who joined our membership meeting via slideshow a couple of weeks ago. And if you missed it, you can still view the slides and comments by logging on to our website, opening our newsletter to page 2. And at the end, at the last slide, you will be treated to a very special reward. And if you have a few more minutes while you're online on our website, open up our blog. There's several really great stories in there that I'm sure you will enjoy. And for any of you talented artists, look at our 2023 tote bag design contest also on the webpage. Before we introduce today's speaker, the Society would like to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, who continue to steward these lands and waters as they have since time immemorial. We recognize Washington's tribal and indigenous or native organizations, which actively create, shape, and contribute to our thriving communities. The Redmond Historical Society is committed to doing our part to engage with and amplify the voices of Native peoples and tribes. And now I'll hand it over to Margie Rockenbeck, the lead in today's program. Margie?
Sorry, now I'm unmuted, I think. Hello, friends, and welcome again to the first program of our Spring 2022 Speaker Series. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce a man who will give us an inside look at a dramatic true crime in modern Washington history. It became something much bigger by the time it finally ended. It became a national story that spanned many states. Some of you will remember when it happened, and some may have read about it more recently in places like the Smithsonian. Rob Lopresti was a government documents librarian at Western Washington University in Bellingham as this story began to unfold. Lucky for us, not only was he a protagonist in the solving of a crime, but he is a well-known mystery writer as well. So Rob really knows how to tell a story, and he has prepared a packed program for us today. To today's live audience, please remember you can enter any questions you have for our speaker in the chat area at the bottom of your screen, and Holly and I will do our best to ask them of our speaker at the end of the program. And now let's welcome today's speaker, Rob Lopresti. Rob.
Thank you very much, Margie and John and Holly and all. Thank all of you for coming. This is great fun for me. I'm going to get the PowerPoint presentation going here. And let's see, share, there we go. I was told my microphone sounded a little quiet, so I hope someone will speak up. One of the moderators will speak up and tell me if there's a problem. But here we are. Okay, catching a map thief. That's the subject. So our adventure started at Western Washington University. I was a librarian there from 1987 until I retired in 2018. Western is in Bellingham. It is a state school, a publicly purpose school, as they call it now. And it had about 12,000 students when this adventure takes place. Now has about 16,000 students. And you are looking at the Mabel Zoe Wilson Library. which is where this action takes place. Actually, at the other building on the other side of the library, but same thing. I was, for most of those years, I had the title of Government Information Librarian. And Government Information Librarian is a specialty because the government publishes information in ways different from the rest of the world. And so it becomes a matter of specialization to know how to find these things. I mostly help people find laws and regulations and court decisions, statistics, I even wrote a book about that, reports from the government, congressional hearings, and things like that. We were also a federal depository library. Anytime you walk into a library and you see that symbol on the door, it means that the library is a federal depository, which means the government sends them publications for free, and they are legally obligated to make them available to the public. So if, for example, you walked into a private university and the library was not open to the public, they would still be required to let you look at government publications if they had that symbol on the door. Okay. So we moved back in time to February 2006. It was the Friday before President's Day weekend. And my assistant at the time was Julie Fitzgerald. This was literally her last full week on the job. She was moving to become the head of a different department in the library. But on that Friday, she went down to see if the student workers had been putting the government documents away properly on the shelves. And when she went there, she saw an older man. It turned out he was 73 years old, which doesn't seem as old to me as it did back in 2006. And he was looking at some of our older publications. Now, he was perfectly entitled to do that. As I said, we're required to make those government publications available, but at Western, anyone is welcome to walk in and use any publication. But he was behaving in a way that she found suspicious. Now, basically, he was looking around to see if anyone was paying attention to what he was doing. And I want to emphasize that Julie did not do anything wrong. She followed the rules at the time. We have changed the rules since then. Specifically, she did not see him doing anything that she thought she could report. But she did go back twice during the day to see if she could see anything that looked suspicious. The third time, he actually asked her where to get a good cup of coffee in town. But again, she did not see anything to report, so she did not report anything. And let's see, right, suspicious behavior. The library was closed for part of the weekend because it was President's Day weekend. And on Tuesday, she came back. And this is the most important thing that happened. This is the reason I'm able to tell you this story at all, is she did follow up. She went looking to see if she could find the books that he had been looking at. They weren't on the table where he had been looking at them. They weren't on the truck waiting to be put away. They weren't on the shelf where they belonged. She found them out of order, upside down, stuck in the stacks. Stacks being what librarians call, what the rest of the world calls bookcases. Okay? And when she picked up the book, she found they had been clearly damaged. Pages had been sliced out of them. She went looking for me and found me walking through the stacks. And I will always remember she said, "We've got a problem." Okay, so this is what we call a trigger warning. The next few slides may not be suitable for all audiences. If you get disturbed by seeing books that have been brutally damaged on purpose, I'm going to suggest you close your eyes for the next few seconds. I will tell you when it's safe again. Okay, so close your eyes now. Okay, it's safe now. Those are some of the books that we found damaged. I'll tell you in a minute about how many books we found damaged. But now it's my my favorite part of the talk, because I get to be a government information librarian and talk to you about the congressional serial set. I'd actually be interested if you've heard of the congressional set or the serial set, sometimes called the sheepskin set because they used to be bound in sheepskin. If you've heard of that before, I wouldn't mind if you put it in the chat box that you had. We can look at that later. The congressional, and by the way, what I'm going to tell you now is slightly simplified, but the exceptions are not that interesting. The congressional serial set are reports to Congress and reports from Congress. And they have been published since essentially 1789 when the first Congress happened. Let's see, reports to and from Congress, right? And in the old days, 150 years ago, they were really reports, meaning that the reports were published individually and then they were bound together in books, which made it much more likely that there would be pieces missing, which means there are a lot of incomplete volumes. But that is the serial set, excuse me. And this is an example of a report, a government report found in the serial set. It is from 1916, and it is a tentative draft of legislation to make money available to put sewers in the Auditor's Building in Washington, D.C. I picked this for a very specific reason. In a 10-minute search, it was the most boring subject I could come up with. And I figured that most of you think that's what a congressional report is like. So my job for the next few minutes is to convince you that that's not what all congressional reports are like. Excuse me. So I'm going to show you some more publications that are available in the congressional serial set in chronological order. So the first one, this is Lewis and Clark's report on the Native American tribes that they encountered on their expedition through the what is now the Western United States. This is a report from the House Committee on Private Land Claims about George Bush, not that George Bush. This is George W. Bush, not that George W. Bush. Some of you may be familiar with this gentleman. He was George Washington Bush, and he was a very successful horse dealer in St. Louis, Missouri in the 1840s. And when the Oregon Trail opened up, he decided to move his family out to Oregon. That required a wagon train, which required a lot of people. And since there were people who wanted to go and didn't have the money, he actually provided them with the money so that he could get out to Oregon. They made it out successfully, and to his shock, when he got there, he discovered that he was not legally permitted to live in Oregon territory. So he violated some international agreements by crossing the Columbia River into what was then British territory, Hudson Bay Company territory, what is now Washington, and he built a farm in Tumwater, Washington, what is near Olympia, Washington today. And a lot of the people who came out west with him felt safer living near him, so they went across the border, across the river, into what is now Washington State. And this happened to be the very time that the United States and Great Britain were discussing where the northern border should be, or the southern border, depending on which part you're on. And there are some historians who think that one of the reasons Britain agreed to have the border where it currently is that they knew that there were Americans that had already settled in there. And if that's the case, then George Bush is one of the reasons that we are not currently living in the southern part of British Columbia. There are other historians who say, no, the Britons couldn't have known about it. It happened too close to the time and communication wasn't that good. So we don't know that for sure. But if I was teaching a class right now for the students, I would say, can you guess why, excuse me, I haven't explained the most important part. This report is about the fact that the Oregon Territorial Legislature, one of the first things they did when they were created was petition Congress to allow George Bush and his family to own the land that they were farming in Washington Territory. And what I would ask the students is, why in the world was this man not allowed to own the land he farmed? And the reason is, he was a free mulatto. In other words, he was an African American. And at that time, African Americans could not live in Oregon Territory, and they could not own land in Washington Territory. And so the territorial legislature asked that not that the law be changed, but that a special exception be made just for the Bush family. And this, by the way, is an example of a private law. A private law is one that makes an exception to the general law for one person. And genealogists love these things because sometimes they can find information about a family member who would not otherwise appear in the historical record. But she was granted a pension, government pension through a private law, or he was granted citizenship, even though he didn't have the proper papers because the country he came from wouldn't send them. So those are examples of private laws, which you can find in the congressional serial set. This is an illustration from the report on Admiral Perry's expedition to Japan in 1856. This is a illustration of Mount Baker from 1859. Now, some of you may be saying, wow, I'm amazed that the government was able to publish in color back then. And in fact, the government wasn't publishing in color. These illustrations back then were done in black and white, and then artists paid by the government colored them, okay? Which means each one is going to be slightly different, which means art collectors consider each of these prints to be an individual work of art, which is kind of relevant to our story, as you'll see. Okay, so I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Pig War, the last time that the United States and British troops faced off against each other, which happened in 1860 on the island, on San Juan Island in Washington State. This is a report on the conditions just before the Pig War, when San Juan Island was occupied by both forces. Postal rights of inmates in insane asylums. Now, my daughter would probably say at this point, well, that's random. Why is this at all interesting? Well, here's what happened. A husband and a wife argued about religious beliefs, and the husband was so offended by his wife's disagreement on that subject that he had her locked in an insane asylum. After 6 years, she escaped, and when her story became known, Congress wanted to hold a hearing about this. But in those days, they were very careful to separate federal matters from state matters. And hospitals and insane asylums were in the governance of the state. So to make it a federal issue that Congress could hold a hearing about, they said, well, these inmates don't have the right to mail letters. So then it becomes a post office issue, and then it's a federal issue. So this is actually a report about a woman who was locked up for 6 years because she disagreed with her husband on religion. This is a hearing held on the Titanic disaster. And a lot of the text, a lot of the dialogue that appears in the early movie about the Titanic, A Night to Remember, actually comes from these hearings. It is a rare example of a congressional hearing showing up in the congressional serial set. They don't usually. This is a report on the Sammamish River. I'll bet you can guess why I included this one. I believe it's from 1912. And it is the earliest publication in the serial set I could find that mentions Redmond, Washington. Okay. Study on Maya hieroglyphs. This is a study on dowsing rods. The death camps in Nazi Germany. Employment of homosexuals and sex perverts in the government, 1950. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that not everything in the serial set is as boring as reports on auditors, the sewers in the auditor's building. Okay, a little more about the serial set. There is no library in the world, including the Library of Congress, that has a complete set of the serial set volumes. I believe they're up to about 16,000 volumes now. Okay. And because there is no library with a complete print set, that made it an obvious choice for the big tech companies to say, well, we'll digitize it. We'll create a digitized set. And they did. And at the time that this event happened, you could pick up a digital set, an internet-based set of the complete serial set for a mere $600,000. I can assure you I did not even suggest to my boss, the Dean of Libraries, that we should spend $600,000, because all I would have gotten out of that he would have a good laugh. However, back in 2018, just before I retired, we were able to purchase it because we got a special grant from the state to buy digital material that we needed. And we bought so much material from the ProQuest company that they essentially threw in the digital set as just a freebie. was just a couple of grand. And when I reported this at a government information library meeting, one of the librarians shouted, "I hate you!" Because she was so jealous. I don't think she was serious, but she was so jealous that we had it. For example, the Washington State Law Library did not have a copy of it, which is crazy. So what use is the serial set? Well, you've probably gotten some idea from the examples I gave you, but I'm going to show you two examples of how the serial set has been used. We don't have a reference desk in the library anymore because people don't come to the reference desk and say, who is the 10th president of the United States? They just Google that. But what we do have is the research and writing studio, where people can come in to get help writing a term paper, figure out how to format it properly, how to do citations and footnotes. And they come in and say, I need to find 50 sources on the pygmy crocodile. And we help them with that kind of research. So we have much less of the easy questions and much more of the hard questions. So I was sitting at the desk one day in the spring of 2018. I'm sorry, not at a desk, at a table with a lanyard and a name badge that says Robert Lopresti, reference librarian. And I have a big sign in front of me that says, ask me questions. And I realized that at the next table over from me, there were two college students, and they have their phones out, and they are calling random government agencies in Walla Walla County and asking, do you have any information on the history of the Walla Walla River? Let me remind you, I am sitting at the table next to them with a sign that says, ask me questions. But no, they are choosing to call up government agencies in Walla Walla. So I pick up my tablet computer and I walk over to them and say, let me tell you about the congressional serial set. 200 results. That is a round number, but it's not cut off at 200. It just happened to be 200 reports that mention the Walla Walla River. If you look down in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see that one of them is a hearing. 32 of them are reports. Some of them are private bills and public bills, and 168 are documents. What they're calling documents is what I meant by reports to Congress. When they use the term report, they mean a report from some part of Congress. And so you have these 200 reports. They are all authoritative because they're from the government. And you can put them in chronological order, so you can see the oldest ones first. And when I left an hour later, the two students were still happily working their way through all this material. So that's one example of things you can do with the congressional serial set. Now, when I was going through the volumes of the serial set looking for damage after this event that I've been telling you about in 2006, I discovered this report, Alleged Abstraction of Books from the House Library. This is a very bizarre story. On the day that the Electoral College confirmed Lincoln as the next president of the United States, the New York Times published an article claiming that as the southern states seceded, representatives from the southern states borrowed books from the Library of Congress with the intention of not returning them, stealing them to start a library in the South. And Congress immediately held hearings on it. And basically it turned out that the whole story was bogus, really bad journalism, gossiping government bureaucrats, and a library that had no catalog and wasn't keeping track of what was borrowed. So it was a real ridiculous story. And together with August Imholtz, who is one of the world's authorities on the serial set, I wrote an article about this event, which appeared in a journal called Library and Information History. And the hardest part of this article was taking it seriously because it's such a bizarre story. So, you know, we wrote up this very scholarly, serious article, and once it was published, with August's permission, I wrote up this article, which appeared in an American Libraries magazine, How Overdue Books Caused the Civil War. You can find it on the web if you want to, in which I get to point out all the absurdities of the story. And I'll just tell you, one of my favorite things is somehow the Dred Scott decision gets involved in it. And if you want to, you can read the article, or you can ask in chat, and I'll explain how Dred Scott got tangled up in the entire mess. So those are two examples of the serial set. But now let's get back to the theft. The reason I bring up the serial set, if I didn't make that clear, is that with two possible exceptions, all the books that were damaged were from the serial set. So what was stolen from our library? Well, over the next month, we determined that more than 100 books have been damaged. More than 600 pages were stolen. 74% of them were maps, 22% were prints or photos or tables. The other 4%, we can't determine what they were. We know something was sliced out, but because the indexing in the 1800s was not all that great, we couldn't be sure what was actually missing. So, let's see. I'm going to refer to these as stolen maps, but as you can see, not all of them are. So what was stolen? These are some actual pages that were taken from our collection. Again, this is hand colored. That's a photograph if you can't tell. So, what happened after that? Well, what's the first thing you do when you find out that this sort of thing has happened in your library? Well, I can tell you that the first thing I thought was, let's pretend it never happened and hide it. But if you do that, you're sleeping with the enemy. It embarrassed me, it embarrassed the library, it embarrassed the university. Doesn't make you look good. And I want to say a few words in my own defense, by the way. One of the first things I did when I got to Western was I locked up the volumes of the serial set that I thought were most likely to be damaged. However, I was simply not pessimistic enough. So I did not try and hide it. I talked to my boss and I notified the university police, notified all the other libraries in the county because we knew this guy had been in town. I notified the internet. Excuse me. By the way, as far as we can tell, he did not go to any of the other libraries in town. Western is, of course, by far the biggest. And about the investigation. We wanted to get the things back if we could, obviously. And so the first question you ask is, what was this guy going to do with it? Well, I was sure he didn't steal 600 pages in order to frame them and hang them on his wall. He was going to try and sell them. So where would he try and sell them? Well, the obvious choice is eBay. Now, I don't know if you're aware of it, but eBay has a feature called a permanent search. So I set up 50 permanent searches for publications from our collection. So an example would be one of the maps that was missing was a nautical map of Buttermilk Channel in New York. And so I put up a permanent search for Buttermilk Channel, which meant that every time for the next 6 months, anyone put up and tried to sell on eBay a map of Buttermilk Channel, a photograph of Buttermilk Channel, a framed poem titled Buttermilk Channel, or anything else, I would be notified about it. And I kept track of every time one of the publications that looked like they could be one of ours showed up on eBay. And on March 6th, I went to my boss and I said, I'm pretty sure I can tell you at least one of the people involved in stealing our publications. There was a store on eBay called Montana Silver, which it said was located on an Indian reservation in Montana. And Montana Silver was selling more pages that looked like ours than the rest of eBay put together. And what I did next was, oh, by the way, I should say this. This is an example from Montana Silver's webpage. This was actually taken much later in the investigation, but there's a reason I'm picking this out as an example. If you look at the word south there, look at the letter H in the word south, and if you run your eyes straight up to the top of that piece of paper, you can see a tiny little blue dot, okay? That tiny little blue dot, I don't know if I can point to it, but there it is. That tiny little blue dot made me very happy, which is why I chose this as an example. And you see, every government report, every government publication in our library has a blue line marked on top of it so that the students know it goes in that part of the library. makes it easier to find them. And I had been hunting for a long time for a publication with a blue dot at the top. So I knew that that one was almost certainly from our personal collection, our library's collection. So Montana Silver, what did I do next? I decided to buy a couple of publications from Montana Silver to see if we could prove they had come from our collection. Now I couldn't buy them myself, because if he saw Bellingham as an address, then he could have destroyed all the evidence with a book of matches. So I had two friends on the East Coast bid on publications that I thought came from our collection, and they won. And I said, don't open them, just send them to the university police. And the university police shipped them immediately to the state library. There's the university police logo. And this is Corporal Bianca Smith, now Sergeant Bianca Smith. If the first bit of great luck we had was Julie Fitzgerald noticing this guy and following up on it, the second great bit of luck we had was Bianca Smith being assigned on the day of the event. She was terrific all the way through, and we wouldn't have had the good results without her. But Bianca Smith sent those maps that we got from my friends on the East Coast, and they sent them to the Washington State Police Crime Lab. And the crime lab used microscopic investigation to prove that those 2 pages specifically had been sliced from the 2 books that I sent them from our collection. So, one more bit of support. Corporal Smith explained to her fellow police officers what had happened, and the officer in charge of parking, there's no symbol for the parking department, so that is a parking lot map of Western. So the officer in charge of parking said, well, gosh, check to see if there were any parking tickets given out that day. And when Corporal Smith pointed that out to me, I was furious. I was outraged, because I'm a mystery writer and I know that you should have done that. It should have been the first thing I suggested. Son of Sam was caught because he got a parking ticket. So I was not the one who thought of that, but Corporal Smith checked it out and discovered a car with Montana license plates had gotten a ticket on campus the day of the theft. And she was able to trace it to James Lyman Brubaker. And she went to the Montana Department of Motor Vehicles, and they sent his picture from his driver's license along with 5 other pictures of older men from Montana. She showed those 6 pictures to Julie Fitzgerald, who, you remember, had seen him, and she picked him out of the lineup immediately. So let's review the evidence. This is essentially the fall of 2006, almost 6 months after the original theft. The evidence is we have a parking ticket for James Brubaker's car on campus the day of the event. We have an eyewitness saying that he was looking at congressional serial set volumes, which he found damaged. The state police crime lab was able to microscopically match maps that we purchased from James Lyman Brubaker to books from our collection. That, I would argue, is a pretty damn strong case. So, at that point, all we had to do was find a government agency who had the jurisdiction and interest to charge Brubaker. And that took an entire year, okay? From the fall of 2006 to the fall of 2007. Now, I should explain that one reason it took so long was Corporal Smith was in charge of finding an agency that would be interested. And this was not her only job. She had plenty of other work to be working on around campus. Another problem was that, you may remember I said Montana Silver said that it was located on an Indian reservation, which made finding someone with the jurisdiction difficult. And it turned out that he was lying. He wasn't located on an Indian reservation, but that complicated matters. And the third complication was that not all government agencies were interested. One agency, who I will not name, told Corporal Smith, we don't work on crimes with only one victim, which pretty much blew the top of my head off, because I said, first of all, we are not the first library that he stole from. He was way too professional. Secondly, we have 12,000 students. That's one victim, and all the students in years to come. However, eventually, Corporal Smith got lucky, if you define luck as what happens when you're persistent and work hard. I should explain what happened first. In June of 2007, I was invited to speak at a panel on rare book theft at the American Library Association in Washington, D.C. And it was a very frustrating situation for me because I described the theft and I described what we had done in terms of security. But when it came to the investigation, all I could say was, I can't tell you. The investigation's ongoing. I couldn't say, we have an idea who it is. Because for all I knew, Brubaker was in the audience, or his best friend was in the audience, or his sainted mother was in the audience. And I couldn't risk letting them know anything. But one thing that happened at that was because of that speech, I was contacted by Steve Toomey, who was there and heard the panel talking. And he was writing an article for Smithsonian Magazine about rare book theft, specifically from the Philadelphia branch of the National Archives. And so he contacted me and he wound up interviewing me, and I'm quoted in his article a couple of times. We'll get back to that. So finally, in the fall of 2007, Corporal Smith's hard work paid off. She contacted Detective Bruce McDermott of the Great Falls, Montana Police Department, because it turned out that Brubaker was actually living in Great Falls. Now, this is where things changed, because McDermott had heard Brubaker's name before. Specifically, he knew that the Montana State Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks was interested in Brubaker. Why in the world would they care about a book thief or a map thief? Well, they thought that he was selling Indian artifacts. And among Indian artifacts are headdresses that contain bald eagle feathers. Bald eagles are an endangered species. Native American tribes are allowed to own historical artifacts that contain them, but you're not allowed to sell them. And so they wanted to investigate Mr. Brubaker, and McDermott said, we've got a state agency who has jurisdiction but no evidence, and we have Western Washington University that has a wheelbarrow full of evidence and has no jurisdiction. Maybe these two agencies would like to talk to each other. And so he did the matchmaking and the handshaking, and things got interesting. Suddenly I was getting a lot of phone calls and emails from Montana, and they said, what was the value of the stolen material? And I gave them 3 estimates, depending on whether you were actually going to buy the pages back from Brubaker, or buy the missing volumes if you could find them, damaged volumes if you could find them, or if you wanted to buy the entire digital set for a mere $600,000. So I gave them 3 figures to play with. And then they called back and said, is anything on Brubaker's store currently available that you believe is from yours? And I sent them a list of those. There was still plenty. And then there was dead silence for a little while. And on December 12th, 2007, the Department of Homeland Security raided Brubaker's property, specifically Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Now you may ask, why in the world are these guys involved in map theft? Well, they figured that Brubaker, they had evidence that Brubaker was selling stolen material across the border into Canada. And once you're selling illegally over the border, Customs wants to have a word with you. Okay? So, the interesting thing is they did not arrest him at the time. We'll get to that in a minute. But what did they find on his property? Well, they found more than 20,000 maps, prints, and lithographs, 800 books with stamps from 100 different libraries, over 1,000 Indian artifacts. Okay. They also found magnets used to desensitize security strips in library books, cutting devices for removing pages from books, sander and coloring agents, both of which would be used to remove the stamps indicating that a book belonged to a library. They also found some stuff that I'm not going to tell you about because it would be too useful to thieves. And I trust you all, but let's be careful. So here's, eventually Mr. Brubaker was arrested. This is his mugshot. And so let's talk about Mr. Brubaker. He was a retired high school football coach. He was also the founder of Art West magazine. And the reason he was, as I understand, the reason he was interested in what became Art West magazine was he owned a foundry. And he would, for artists who worked in metal, he would make copies of their art for them. And one of the results of that was he was a convicted counterfeiter, because he would actually make counterfeit United States coins. And you'd say, well, that's got to be a losing proposition. How can you make any money making a counterfeit quarter, for example? Well, if it's a modern quarter, you can't. But if it's an 1860 quarter and you claim you found it, say, on a Civil War battlefield, well, then you've got a collector's item and someone's going to be interested. So he actually went to prison for a while as a counterfeiter. So that's Mr. Brubaker. Oh, by the way, I remember I had a conference call with the Assistant Attorney General of the state of Washington with McDermott and the federal attorney in Montana. And we said, why hasn't he been arrested? And they said, well, he knows he's in trouble. He thinks he's about to get arrested, and we're watching him. We want to see if he's picking up caches of illegal money and if he's talking to other people who might be involved in this scam of his. But eventually he was arrested, and that happened in March. And at first he pled not guilty. And in fact, he claimed to be indigent, meaning that they had to appoint an attorney for him, in spite of the fact that Montana Silver was the biggest moneymaker on eBay the year that this happened. And by the way, the average map that he was selling sold for about $30. How did he make so much money? Volume, 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 as they say in the advertisements. So what happened next, I'm going to be very careful how I phrase this. He pled not guilty. The attorneys decided to indict his wife as an accessory. At that point, he pled not guilty. I pled guilty, and they dropped the charges against his wife. He was sentenced to 30 months in prison. Now, some of you may think 30 months is not very much. It works out to about a week for every library he robbed. And I don't think it was very much. And when I asked an FBI agent about this, he said, well, it's based on the amount of money that he stole, the monetary value of what he stole. And we contacted all those 100+ libraries and asked what was the value of what was stolen, and only about half of them bothered to reply. So the total amount was not as much as it should have been. That got me pretty irritated. And I mentioned this to another librarian who had been contacted by the FBI, and he said, yeah, but they didn't tell us why they wanted the information. If they had told us that it would affect Brubaker's sentence, we would have replied. So, not so good. March 2008, more than 2 years after the theft, is when the news finally hit the press that Brubaker had been arrested. This was obviously before he was convicted. And on a snowy Saturday, this was the headline on the front page of the Bellingham Herald. And that day, a number of reporters and TV stations in Seattle wanted to contact me. One of them actually decided to drive up to Bellingham, which meant I had to get permission to open the library, which was closed, and let them in, and so they could interview me. My favorite part of that interview on television was they reported that we had decided to lock up all illustrated books in the library, which would be hilarious to try and do that. It was not accurate. But anyway, that was an adventure. A couple of days after this article appeared in the paper, I was at the co-op getting some groceries, and the grocery clerk checking me out looked up at me and said, "Are you the guy?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm the guy." And he nodded and I nodded. And that was my 15 minutes of fame. You remember Steve Toomey had contacted me for the article he was writing about theft from the National Archives branch. And I contacted him as soon as Brubaker's stuff had been raided, and they published this sidebar to the main article. They never mentioned his name in it because he hadn't been arrested at the time that the article was written. They actually sent a photographer up from Seattle to take my picture, and the photographer's assistant rearranged the books, the serial set volumes on the shelf to make them look better for the picture. So, strange story. Field trip. Just about the time Brubaker was sentenced, when he was in jail, the FBI invited me to come out to Great Falls, Montana, and the university paid for me to come out there. And I was able to go to the FBI office to look at the 20,000 pages that they had collected from Brubaker's property to try and find ours. And the field office in Montana at the time had 2 FBI agents, and one of them was off at a conference, which meant that the other FBI agent, every time he needed to go to a meeting or use the restroom or whatever, he had to lock me out because I couldn't be left in there with all those classified files and things. But several librarians from Montana, including one who used to work at Western, volunteered to help, and we tried to go through all of his publications. Those are not FBI file cabinets. Those are Brubaker file cabinets in the FBI office. Those cardboard boxes you see behind them are boxes of books that they took from his property. And so we were able to go through those 20,000 pages. This is from the Great Falls Tribune, by the way, an article that appeared. And this is another picture from the Great Falls Tribune of me examining some of the pictures. So what did Western receive out of all this? Well, we received 3 of our books that were found in his stash, 190 page maps and other pages that were from our books or matched pages that had been taken from our books. And the next thing is kind of interesting. Of those 800 library books, or I'm sorry, about 1,000 books that were found in his collection, 200 of them he had already erased the stamps, so they couldn't tell which library they had come from. So the FBI decided they were going to sell them. And I said, no. So I actually wrote to the judge and said, instead of selling them, those books ought to go to Western, because if it wasn't for Western, nobody would even know that they'd been stolen. And the judge said, yeah, you're right. So we got about 200 books that came from other libraries that we were not able to, or the FBI was not able to identify. Now, there was a librarian there at the time, a cataloger named Marian Alexander, and she did what can only be described as forensic cataloging at this point, because she went through the catalogs of other libraries and was able to track down 3 of the books as coming from particular libraries. And so we were able to send 3 books back to those libraries, which they did not, in some cases, they hadn't even known were missing. So Marion can literally claim that she solved 3 crimes that stumped the FBI. Eventually, years later, we got some money from Brubaker, which he had been required by the judge to give him, but eventually he got around to it. So here are some pictures of the boxes that we received from the FBI of publications that had been stolen from our collection and we got back. So what has happened since the theft? Well, what has happened since the theft is we changed, we locked up a lot of material from the serial set that we had not locked up before. We tightened security and we changed our policies. And if you want to know how we tightened security and we changed our policies, I'm not going to tell you because it would just help thieves. But rest assured, it would be a lot harder to steal from the Western than it would be today. And by the way, I've since then spoken at several library conferences about how to tighten security. Okay. And that, I believe, is everything I've got, and I would be delighted to answer questions for you.
Rob,
Yes.
hi. It's Margie here. And we have some questions for you. What happened to people who bought the maps? Do you know anything about?
That's a great question. We were not able to, we did not try to track down anyone who bought the maps unknowingly. We did get emails from, I think, 4 or 5 people who said, I bought maps from Brubaker. If here's what I bought. If any of them are yours, I'll send them back immediately. So there are honest people out there. As it happened, none of them were our maps, but it's nice to know that they were willing to. Another thing, by the way, I didn't mention is that as soon as Brubaker was raided, eBay closed down his store, closed down Montana Silver, and he promptly tried to open up again under another name, and eBay caught him and closed that down. eBay was completely cooperative throughout the whole thing, by the way.
What has happened to him? Do you know anything about him since he got out?
Oh, thank you for asking. Yes, he died in 2013. And before that happened, after he was out of prison and before he died, his daughter was arrested with, I believe, her husband. If it wasn't husband, it was boyfriend, accused of stealing money and drugs from the school that she worked at. Whether she was convicted or not, I do not know. I never met him, by the way. No desire to.
I have heard of other library thefts, notably in one from the Library of Congress, where it was reported and the materials were gotten back to the library, and yet it was never, as far as I know, prosecuted as a crime or reported anywhere. Do you have anything to say about that? Why is that? Do you?
Well, there could, of course, be several reasons. I think one reason is a bad reason, which is you don't want to admit that it happened. You could say, well, we don't want to let thieves know that we're vulnerable, but I think that's the wrong attitude. I think you need to speak up, which is what we did. And why it doesn't get prosecuted? Well, some people say, yeah, who cares about a book? Sometimes it's hard to find a government agency willing to act on it, as we discovered. Yeah, if Bianca Smith had not been so persistent, it would have never happened, even though we knew who it was.
Wow. Holly, do you have any questions to add?
There were a couple others in the chat. One wondering where Brubaker was imprisoned.
That's a great question. I don't know. I assume it was in Montana, but I don't know. I'm sure we could look it up. I'm a librarian. I could look it up. But no, I don't know off the top of my head. I just wanted him to be away from me.
Do you happen to know if it was a federal prison or any more details about sort of the sentencing and how much money he had to repay?
I should know how much money he had to repay, but that's lost from my memory after all these years. It was, yeah, I believe it was in the, I think if you aimed around $10,000, you'd be in the ballpark. Yeah, again, I've completely lost that detail. I believe it was a federal prison, but I know it was a federal prosecutor, so I assume he went to a federal prison. But again, that wasn't something that interested me. I wasn't sending him postcards or anything.
Would you say, sort of more in general, is this kind of theft common, or is this a fairly isolated incident?
It's definitely not an isolated incident. It's not define common. It's not common like car theft is common, but it does seem to happen a few times a year. If you Google rare book theft, you'll find plenty of stuff. There's actually a couple of books about rare book theft, and at least one of which the Western incident got mentioned. By the way, there's an old saying, if you like Laws and Sausage, you shouldn't watch them being made. If you like news stories, you shouldn't watch them being made either, because I could point out all the mistakes that appeared in all the things. Like a number of people said, Robert Lopresti found this guy in the No, I wasn't. It was Julie Fitzgerald, and Julie Fitzgerald, a librarian. No, Julie's not a librarian. She's one of the library staff members, and on and on and on and on. And my favorite, of course, being we're going to lock up all the illustrated books. I've forgotten what I was talking about. I'm sorry. Oh, is it very common? It's not. It does happen. You can find a couple of examples per year. And as I said, just Google rare book theft and you'll find it.
Are there, in particular, any thefts of like a similar magnitude or notoriety that you know of?
Yeah, there's a famous one, and I'm sorry. 10 years ago, I could have pulled the name off the top of my head, but I can't. I believe the book written about it was called The Book Thief. I could be wrong about that. There was this very distinguished book seller who used to go into one of the big university libraries, and he would spend hours in the rare book room. And one day, as he was leaving the library, if I remember correctly, a razor blade fell out of his coat, and whoever saw it realized there was a problem, and that led to finding that he'd been stealing a whole lot of material out of books. There are very particular ways that you're supposed to do these things. You're supposed to have a glass table so they can't have anything underneath it. They're supposed to be wearing gloves. They're not allowed to have anything except a pencil you give to them, and so on. And some people follow the rules and some people don't follow. By the way, I don't know if any of you have seen a movie called American Animals. I think I've got that title right. You might want to look it up. It's not a great movie, but it's based on an actual event, a rare book theft that happened at Transylvania University in Transylvania, Pennsylvania, about 10 years ago. Totally bizarre story. 4 young men, I don't think any of them were students at Transylvania, decided to steal a copy of Audubon's American Birds and a few other books. And they screwed it up thoroughly. And the movie is interesting because they say this is not based on a true story, this is a true story, which is flat out wrong. For one thing, they completely leave out the director of the library who risked her life trying to prevent this. They just left her out entirely, I'm sure because she didn't give them permission. And the other interesting thing about the movie is they'll show it from the point of view of one of the people involved, and then they'll show it from a different point of view, and it's a completely different story. But I do recommend it, American Animals. And if I'm wrong, I will contact Margie with the right title, but I'm pretty sure that's right. And that is an example of an actual theft by complete amateurs who screwed up. And good, I'm glad they screwed up. And they all went to jail. Sorry.
I think another kind of interesting question, someone asked if there's any ways to tell if items like this that are for sale are legitimate, or if there's sort of any clues you can maybe find to suggest that they've been stolen.
That's a great question, and there's no easy information answer. If you actually got your hands on it, you can certainly look for library stamps or evidence that a library stamp was gone. Keep in mind, of course, that if you went into a used bookstore and found a copy of the congressional report of Admiral Perry's trip to Japan, you would be perfectly within your rights to slice it up, sell each page individually. I wouldn't recommend you do it, but you could do it if you legally owned it. But of course, if it said library property, you shouldn't do that. You should return it. So there's no guaranteed way to do that. One of the people who said, I bought maps from Brubaker, or any of them yours, said, I actually asked him where he was getting them from, and he said that he had inherited a collection and he was selling it off, which is certainly possible that someone could do that. So you can certainly ask somebody where they got these publications from, and If you think it's theft, you could try and report it, but if you don't know where they stole it from, good luck with that. Well, I had another thought and it's vanished from my tiny mind. I'm sorry.
That's quite all right. Are there any sort of security measures that you can tell us about? I know you mentioned you don't want to give too much away, but anything as far as libraries adding security cameras, or I know quite a few historical archives require that you kind of leave all materials at the door, so to speak, to limit sort of what you can bring in. Is there anything you'd like to speak to on that?
Nope.
Okay.
And I should say, by the way, I haven't worked there in 4 years, right, or all 3.5 years. So I don't know what the current situation is. But no, I'm not going to say anything else about it. It would be counterproductive, as they say.
Yeah, my best suggestion is to always make sure you're following all of the posted rules, because if there are rules for a reason, even if they may not seem to make sense.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mhm. Let's see, is there anything else you can tell us about Brubaker? There was someone interested in anything else you might know about him outside of being a football coach, any sort of connection to this
Well, I can
subject.
tell you one thing. This is according to what the FBI told me. He used to travel around the country, going with his wife and a friend. By the way, the friend was, in my opinion, also involved in this. And they used to go to wherever University of Montana was playing away games, football games. And that was his excuse or explanation for why he was in Washington State. Montana was playing in Seattle, you see. So that was his explanation if anyone ever asked him why were you there? Oh, we went there for the football. My theory was that this thief, before I knew who it was, had actually gotten himself locked into the library over the weekend. Remember, the library was closed part of the weekend for President's Day weekend. And that was how he had the time to do all this theft. He says he didn't do it. He says he got all 600 pages out in one day. I find that hard to believe. And I believe that's everything I know about him.
Okay. We did get a couple people who confirmed American Animals is correct, and that it's directed, written by Bart Layton, if anyone's interested in looking up that piece.
Yeah, I blog every other Wednesday, mostly about mystery fiction, at a blog called sleuthsayers.com. And before that, 12 to 14 years ago, I blogged every Wednesday at a place called Criminal Brief. Okay, if you type in Criminal Brief and Robert Lopresti, you'll find me. And I actually reported on these events as soon as Brubaker was arrested, and I could, I was permitted to talk about it. So you could look up my name and Brubaker and you'll find it. I also wrote there briefly about the Transylvania mess, years and years before the movie was made. So you can look that up if you want to. Again, that would be a Criminal Brief. Or if you want to see what I'm talking about lately, you can find it at Sleuthsayers. That SLEUTHSAYERS.com.
Right, and we can send a link out in our follow-up email too.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no more questions, I just want to say thank you, Rob, for this enlightening, fascinating story. We look forward to seeing you again here at the Redmond Historical Society.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
And I appreciate all of you coming on a beautiful day.
Thanks. Holly?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, John and Margie, for all your help with our program today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you have any other questions or feedback, you can always write me at manager@redmondhistoricalsociety.org. And keep an eye out for a follow-up email this coming week with a link to the recording, as well as any additional information and information on our upcoming 2 March programs. So our evening speaker series will be in partnership with the Redmond Library on Wednesday, March 9th at 7 p.m. This will feature author David Berger and Sumi artist Fumiko Kimura. discussing their book Persimmon and Frog, the story of Sumi artist Fumiko Kimura. And on Saturday, March 12th at 10:30 a.m., attorney and indie filmmaker Steve Edmiston will be returning to give a talk on the Men in Black and how Pacific Northwest spawned the most enduring characters in UFO history. So I expect those will both be really interesting. You can register for these events on redmondhistoricalsociety.org at any time, and you'll also find on our website information on how to schedule a visit to our display space, information on our upcoming walking tours, and more. So we hope to see you again soon, and until next time, take care.